You know, I have to correct something from last week. And not so much a correction as it is, I overlooked it. And I thought, you know, when I go home, I look at my notes and see what I did and didn't hit. Well, what I missed out on was, remember, Paul and Silas were preaching and they cast this demon out of this young lady, and the owners of the young lady, her controllers, her masters, drug them before the magistrate in the city. And that's where I left it. But according to Roman policy, when they drag someone before the magistrate, the first thing they would do is beat them with rods. That beat the truth out of them, see, a confession. Sound familiar? And Paul and Silas allowed this. And then they should have had a trial, which they didn't get. And then they were thrown into jail. Then, of course, we have the story of the Philippian jailer, right? Earthquake. The jailer's going to kill himself because they've all run away, but really nobody's run away. So the jailer is all happy. He asks, how can I be saved? What must I do to be saved? He cleans their wounds, feeds them, and then he puts them back in jail. So in the morning when the policemen come to get them and to get them out of the city, they could just escort them to the gate. The problem was they were recognized as Jewish vagabonds. These Jewish vagabonds, were they? They were Roman citizens. And to be a Roman citizen, you had a passport, just like we have passports today. And that passport would have been signed by 12 Roman men in your hometown. Like Paul, it would have been Tarsus, and with Silas, perhaps Jerusalem. And why didn't they show these passports when they were taken to the magistrate? It would have saved a beating, a whooping, because it would have taken a long time to verify that they were indeed Roman citizens. They would have to go back to their hometown, to Tarsus in Paul's case, and find the documentation that made him a Roman citizen. And he was born a Roman citizen, but there's documentation for that. And ditto Silas. And that could take 2 or 3 months. You know, you don't get on a plane and fly over there. You walk over there. So it's 1,000 miles. So rather than go through that, they endured the caning, the beating. And then the next day, after the Philippian jailer had put him back in jail, the police came and said, out! And Paul said, au contraire. Now he lets them know that he is a Roman citizen, that they are Roman citizens, both Paul and Silas. And the magistrates instantly go, oh no, what have I done? Oh. To beat or abuse a Roman citizen would be punishable up to by death. But you would lose your job, you would lose your prestige, and in Philippi you would lose your citizenship, and that was a free city. So this is a big deal. This isn't some small little thing. This is a big deal. And the magistrates were apologetic. They said, "No, I'm sorry." And Paul and Silas obliged them by leaving. They went to Lydia's house and then they left. But I didn't say that last week, and it bothered me that I didn't share that little tidbit of history with you. So with that, let me see if I can do this. Hey, see, it works for me too, Bill. Paul and Silas were escorted out of the city, and they went from Philippi down here to Thessalonica. Now that's about 2 inches on this screen, but it's in reality 100 miles. They'd been beaten, they were sore, and they walked 100 miles to Thessalonica. And that's kind of where we left off last week. I know we started in on it and didn't quite finish. Oh, one more point, now that I see my points. Put my glasses on. There are only two instances in the New Testament where the Gentiles actually got after the apostles. This was one of them in Philippi, and the other one will come up a little bit later in Ephesus. Now they were stirred up by the Jews several times, but on their own, only twice did the Gentiles bother the apostle. This is one of the cases in Philippi, and the other one is going to be in Ephesus. The rest of the time, it's the Jews. Okay. So now, verse 1 through 3. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Every time Paul and Silas, or Paul and Barnabas, here, you get the red streak for that. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, they came to Thessalonica. Thessalonica, by the way, was named after Alexander the Great's sister. Her name was Therma, and named after that because of the hot springs that are there. And if you know anything about Roman culture, they just loved their baths. They had baths everywhere. There's still one in London. Okay, and according to Paul's custom, he went into them, that is the synagogue of the Jews, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, "This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of leading women. So they walk 100 miles from Philippi down to Thessalonica, and the first thing that Paul does is he goes into the synagogue. I didn't do that. So he goes into the synagogue, and he reasons. It says he reasoned with the Jews. He reasoned from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. He was that blessing talked about, a promise to Abraham. And there's 355 Messianic prophecies, but there's enough scriptures, to prove that Jesus was the Christ, and nobody else could be the Christ but Jesus. And those are the things that he debated with them. He reasoned with them. Verse 3, and explaining and giving evidence that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of leading women. So let's go back to explaining and giving evidence that Christ was the Messiah. If you're speaking to Jews, you're going to use one example. You can use the Scriptures. The Old Testament would lead you to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus is the Christ. But if you're going to talk to Gentiles, you're going to have to take a whole new approach, because they don't deal with the Old Testament Scriptures. So Paul starts out, it says, explaining and giving evidence that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead. This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. So he is telling these Jews, Jesus is the Christ. Want some examples? And just for a little exercise, for a fun exercise, you can make up your own list. I had to hold it down to 7 or 8 because I didn't want to take the whole class just producing evidence. So what did Paul preach to the Jews? Well, for one thing, he told them that the Messiah who is going to come will be born in Bethlehem. You mean that little jerkwater little town up here, this white spot in the road? Yes. In Micah 5:2, it says, "But as for you, Bethlehem, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be a ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago and from the days of eternity. So there's evidence, if you were a Jew, that the Christ would be born in Bethlehem. Here's a sign. God said back in Isaiah, he says, I'm going to give you a sign. And this is one like a lady on the Titanic when it was sinking says, now this is something you don't see every day. Well, this sign is something you don't see every day, because in Isaiah 7:14, it says he would be born of a virgin. That's easier said than done. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. Mary was a virgin. And she bore a child, and they named him Emmanuel. That's a piece of evidence. If you were a Jew, you got to put that in your head and say, now there's a piece of evidence. Jesus was to be born of the tribe of Judah. Anything significant about the tribe of Judah? Anybody? Yeah, Mike.
David the king was from.
Yes. More than that, it was the kingly tribe.
Right.
And by rights, Jesus was the rightful king, not Herod.
That was Genesis 48.
Genesis 49:10, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Jesus was the rightful king, and he was from the kingly tribe, Judah. It says Jesus would be a descendant of David. In Isaiah 11:1, then in that day the nations will resort to root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the people, and his resting place will be glorious. In Isaiah 11:10, then in that day the nations will resort. Wait a minute, I missed one here. 11:1, I read the wrong one. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. Who was Jesse's son? David. And Jesus is a descendant of David. And in Matthew 1:5, if you're reading through the genealogies, which would have been in the temple if you really were serious about who is this guy, you could go to the temple and read about him. And I'll read it to you just as soon as I put my glasses on. And to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab, and to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth, and to Obed Jesse, and to Jesse David the king. In Matthew 1:5 and forward are all the genealogies of Jesus, all the way back to Abraham. I think it goes back to, back to Adam. One goes to Abraham, one goes to Adam. This one went to Abraham.
Yeah.
Luke goes all the way back. I didn't look that up, so. So he was a descendant of David, the rightful king. If you want to prove that the scriptures are inspired, if someone says, prove it to me, all we have to do is read Daniel 9, 10, 11, and 12. It's all there. And in Daniel 9, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says 70 weeks have been declared. That's 70 weeks of 7. If you want to add that up, that's 490 years from the time that Daniel wrote to when Jesus appeared. Daniel got it right. There is so much evidence in Daniel 9, 10, 11, and 12. I mean, Cleopatra is mentioned. All kinds of rulers are mentioned. How could Daniel know that years in advance because he was inspired. And people that say, here's an argument. People will say that, well, these things are true, but the writer who said he was Daniel wrote it long after Daniel was dead. The problem with that is simple. Ptolemy invited 70 Jewish scholars down to interpret the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, called the Septuagint. And he did that, I think it was about 250 BC, something like that. So they had Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament from 250 on. So that shows you that that what Daniel had to say was true. And you just have to go, well, of course it is. And the Jews had to say the same thing. I got it now. Bill, do you have it now?
I do. It's interesting there's no record here that he performed any miracles. Now, he may have, but I think it's pretty weighty that it's sufficient just to go to the Old Testament prophecies to convince someone that Jesus is the Christ. Mm-hmm. And that's all you need. Now, God's given us so much more evidence for that Jesus is the Son of God. But, you know, like I say, there's no argument made here on miracles. So it's basically, here's the scriptures. They look forward and they prove that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that's enough.
Yeah. I'm going to make mention of miracles, but, you know, Jesus' miracles were done in Israel. He is speaking to people in Greece who may or may not have heard about those. But certainly a good point. And Mike, you were going to say, and then Andy was going to say, and then I'm going to say.
Well, contrary to the way we look at things today, where we would consider something like a miracle to be, you know, perhaps more impressive. Paul was using the right approach with the Jews in Thessalonica.
Amen.
Because they were impressed with the truth of the Scripture, mm-hmm. and they were impressed almost miraculous fulfillment. Well, in some ways it was miraculous fulfillment, the virgin birth and so on. So, although they didn't witness them with their eyes, there was certainly a miraculous component to the evidences that Paul presented to them.
Yeah, very good, very good. By the time these guys get done, I won't have any thunder left. But I'm going to roar anyway. Andy.
Yeah, the Israelites of this time, I mean, they knew Daniel's prophecy. They knew the clock was ticking.
Absolutely.
And they were looking for their Messiah. They were actively looking for that person. Yeah. And they have absolutely no excuse for not accepting Jesus. But it wasn't just them. It was the Magi were also looking. They had served in Nebuchadnezzar's court. They had the same writings that Daniel had, that they had passed on. Mm-hmm. And they were looking, and they understood the prophecy and the signs.
Yeah. And I think that's probably what brought them there in the first place. Yeah. And another note, there were not only the Old Testament, the scrolls were in the synagogues for sure, but also the Old Testament scrolls were in the libraries in Rome and Alexandria and Ephesus and all those places. So these guys are going to go getting a little ahead of myself, but in Berea they were sort of search scriptures daily. Well, they certainly didn't do that at home. They either had to go to the synagogue or they had to go to the library. And it's my understanding anyway that the Romans and the Greeks considered the Jews' Old Testament as literature, and good literature, by the way. Okay. Paul would have also told them about Jesus' character, his appearance, and his work, and the deed he had to do. And that would be in Isaiah 53, 1 through 12. I know we've all read this many, many times, but we'll read it one more time. It is just so good. Put my glasses on. So Isaiah 53, 1 through 12 is about Jesus. It's called the suffering servant. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before us like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He had no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one for whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. This is describing some of the things that are going to happen to the Messiah 700 years in advance. They didn't scourge back 700 years before that. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of all of us to fall upon him. Aren't we thankful? Amen. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shears, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due, his grave was assigned with wicked men. Yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief, if he would render himself as a guilt offering. He will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many. And as he will bear their iniquities, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great. And he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. Isn't that beautiful? If you were a Jew, you would have understood that, because this is past tense to them. Jesus had already died. You think that message got around? It surely did. And Bill, who stole my thunder, you'll be hearing from my attorney. Jesus did perform miracles. He performed miracles to prove that he was from God. He raised the dead. And it seems to me that in so many cases, when he performed a miracle, it was like water off a duck's back to the Jews. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, the Sanhedrin knew about it. Those 70 guys knew that Jesus said, Lazarus, come forward. And all they wanted to do was kill Jesus and Lazarus. But for those that had an honest heart, a good heart, those miracles did their job. They proved that he was from God and that the things he said were from God. And finally, the big one, which Paul would have emphasized, Jesus arose from the dead. You know, if you take a class in comparative religions, no other religious figure has risen from the dead. I know the Muslims say can't think of his name now, rose from the dead. But that was 600 years later. Jesus did it in front of his apostles, in front of the women who served him. And then at one time, 500. He didn't hide it. He didn't wait 600 years, Muhammad, by the way, 600 years to say he was raised from the dead. And they saw him. They saw him. And he would have told them about Hosea 6:2. Come, let us now return to the Lord, for he has torn us, but he will heal us. He has wounded us, but we will be bandaged. He will bandage us. He will revive us after 2 days, and he will rise up on the 3rd day, that we may live with him forever. So let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. For his going is as certain as the dawn, and he will come, and like the rain, like the spring rains, watering the earth. 3 days. How many days was Jesus in the grave? 3. What a coincidence. And he would have pointed that out to them. That 700 years before Jesus was ever born, he would be killed and raised 3 days later. Nobody else has done that. One of my favorite verses, when I read them, they're all my favorite, but one of my favorite verses, Luke 24, 1-7. And you can imagine, if you were Mary Magdalene and Mary and the other women, what they must have felt when they saw Jesus. Because they saw him dead on the cross. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing spices which they had prepared. It's always fascinated me, how would these women roll that great big rock out of the way and get in there? But, as it turned out, they didn't have to. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. And when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And while they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men suddenly stood them in dazzling clothing. And the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. And the men said to them, why do you seek the living one among the dead? He's not here, but he has risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again. If you were one of the women at the tomb, can you imagine the ecstasy they must have felt? And Jesus didn't keep it to himself. He appeared to his apostles. These guys who beat feet faster than you could imagine away from him when he was being arrested, because they were afraid. After they saw him, after they spent 40 days with him, after that, their backs were tungsten steel. They were going to take the word to the world, and nothing could stop them. And as we've been reading, Paul's been beaten several times. And yet, he's determined to preach the gospel. And Paul, unlike us, also got to see the goal. He got a glimpse of heaven. Ooh, what a joy that must have been. Okay, and in verse 4, it says, and some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of leading women. Persuaded them means they had a common lot. They consorted with them. And a large number of God-fearing Greeks. They could have been proselytes. There were proselytes probably in every nation. Or they could have been Greeks who were fed up with paganism and saw the beauty in the law as far as the moral law and its ethics go, which is miles higher than what they had with the pagan gods. And you know, you would think To me, this is real simple. If you put a statue out here and worship it, I would think that that's just downright dumb. Can a statue speak? No. Can it do anything? No. Can it hear your prayers? Don't you think some of those people put that together? Said, listen, Zeus isn't real, Apollo isn't real, Isis isn't real. That's my opinion. You don't have to agree with that, but if you do, it'll show how clever you are. And a number of women, these would have been probably prominent women whose husbands were leaders in the city, they believed because the story is so real. It's so believable. Yes. Let me do this. Got it on the second try.
So, well, anyway, with reference to the last point you made there about the leading women, of course, it was Lydia in Philippi who was one of the anchors of the church there in terms of the original believers. So the gospel went out not only to, both Jew and Gentile, but very much contrary to the day, it went out to men and women alike.
Absolutely.
It didn't discriminate and say, well, you go home, tell your husband, and then come back and you can be a part of this. No, when it said leading women, we already see that example in Lydia, that she was a, commercially successful individual whose business, made her head of her household. And no doubt there were other women like that who had various different enterprises. And so, I mean, it contrary to what people want to attribute to the Bible, it doesn't discriminate against women.
Absolutely not. It glorifies. Fumble. I've seen better hands on rocks, by the way.
I'm done.
Fumble. You're right. And remember, Jesus used the woman at the well to take the gospel to the Samaritans, to share it with them. I met Jesus. So a lot of women have had chances to influence their families. I think in Lydia's case, she probably had sons who helped run her business. She may have been the head of it, but the times being what they were, she probably had to use her sons on the business side. Again, my guess, and that's what I understand from what I've read. So, but now we're going to deal with the fly in the ointment. Always the fly in the ointment. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar and attacking the house of Jason. They were seeking to bring them out to the people. And when they did not find them, that's Paul and Silas, when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men have upset the world. These men who have upset the world have come here also." Oh boy, they're here. And Jason had welcomed them. And they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And they stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things, and when they had received the pledge from Jason and others, they released them. Why would the Jews be so upset? It's my money. If these people leave, what goes with them? Their tithes, their gifts, and these men also are losing their authority and their influence. So with them, it's a social thing. They're losing money. They're not being respected like they want to be respected. So let's put an end to this. And they wanted to kill him. So he got a mob of men from the marketplace. Thugs. That's what he got. Gangsters. And they set the city in an uproar. It seems like Jews are good at setting people in an uproar. All the way from Jesus' trial, in every city he's gone to, the Jews have set the city in an uproar, or most of them. They really were the enemies of the first century church, not the Gentiles. I told you there were only 2 instances where the Gentiles got after the apostles. But there's lots of examples about the Jews wanting to destroy them and get rid of them. And they attacked the house of a man named Jason. How's rolling, Bill? Go ahead.
Yeah, you've got it. Convinced of their motives are not good. I mean, you might think on one hand that they would try to defend what they believe was the Jewish way or the law of Moses, but to win an argument like that, you don't go out and get wicked men and form a mob.
Really? Really?
Yeah. No, I don't advise that today either if you're trying to win a religious argument. You know, godly people who are interested in righteousness and goodness and the truth, that's not how you win an argument.
Absolutely not.
So their motives, you can't even begin to pretend that they were just deceived and they were wanting to support Moses. They, as you said, had other motives that were not good.
Yeah, their motives were this, and influence. And see what a nice guy I am? That's what. So they went to Jason's house. Now there are only 2 Jasons mentioned in the scriptures. This Jason and the Jason over in Romans 16:5, I think. And they could be the same person. And they would have been a relative of, Jason would have been a relative of Paul. Let's see, I wrote it down. Come on, Bill. In 16:21, it says, Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you, and so do Lucius, Jason, and Sopar, my kinsmen. So whether he was referring to all 3 of those as being his kinsmen or just one of them, but Jason here and Jason here may be the same person. Don't know. It's just, you just speculate till the cows come home and you're still just speculating. But this poor guy didn't do anything wrong. And they drag him out of his house and bring him before the magistrates. And they were seeking to bring him out to the people. And when they did not find them, they've been dragging Jason and some brethren, so there's more than one, before the city authorities, shouting, these men have upset the world. These men who have upset the world have come here also. Upset the world means they're teaching Jesus and him crucified. And he ascended back into heaven to the right hand of God. Well, that just rubbed the Jews the wrong way. How can this be? This particular brand of Jew, and there were lots of them, they could have cared less about the scriptures. They could have cared less about Paul's argument that Jesus was the Messiah. This was a social thing for them. They're losing money, they're losing their dignity, and we're going to do something about it. So they go get some thugs from the market, and they drag this poor guy Jason out to them. And these men have upset, and their claim to the magistrates were, these men who have upset the world have come here also. And Jason had welcomed them. Imagine that. Hospitality. And they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar. Is that true? No. You want to explain that? Bill will come over and bring you the microphone, and you have 25 seconds.
So our goal, our command, is to obey Caesar, obey the government, all the time, unless it conflicts with God's laws. But otherwise, no. These men were the best citizens in the world. You couldn't have a better citizen than a Christian. And that's by 25 seconds.
Yes, you're overtime. We'll dock you for that. Jesus, when he was before Pilate, said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my people would fight to save me from the Jews." It's interesting, he doesn't say Romans, he says the Jews. But he also says, "As it is, my kingdom is not of this world." And you're spot on when you say that we are encouraged by our King to obey the laws of the land as much as we can. If something is immoral, that's different. But they stirred up the crowds in the cities, and the authorities heard these things. And when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they released them. Not Paul and Silas, but the men that were arrested with Jason or drugged before the magistrates. And when they had received a pledge, probably the pledge was, "Listen, I'll see to it that these guys don't cause trouble anymore. And oh, by the way, here's a couple of grand to kind of soothe your hurt feelings." So a pledge could have been two things, or both. Just a minute here. And seeing that this isn't going to go well, just like Philippi, the wheels have come off the wagon. So the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they had arrived, they went to where? The synagogue of the Jews. Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Therefore many of them believed, along with a number of prominent Greek women and men. So again, the brethren, fearing for Paul's life and Silas's life, got him out of town and sent him to Berea. Berea is just a short walk. It's only 50 miles. And they could have made that in 2 or 3 days. And it says about the Bereans, they received it with great eagerness. They listened respectfully and intellectually. And there's a great argument there, isn't there? But they were more noble-minded. Now, we talked about this. They were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. So they would have gone to either the synagogue or they would have gone to a library. Don't know if there was a library in Berea or not, but there was certainly a synagogue, and they could go in there and pull those scrolls out and read it for themselves. Say, by jingo, he's right. Therefore, that is Paul's teaching and reasoning with them and teaching from the scriptures and reminding them. Because these Jews would have heard these arguments hundreds of times if you were my age. From the time they were little kids and went to the synagogue, they would have heard those scriptures read over and over and over and over again and explained by the priest. So therefore, many of them believed. And along with a number of prominent Greek women and men. Greek men and women who may have been proselytes, but like I mentioned earlier, they were probably disgusted with pagan worship, and they saw a value and a worth in the law, in the moral law and their ethics. Okay. And we'll end here. But when the Jews of Thessalonica found out that the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul in Berea, also they came there as well, and stirring up the crowds. We're out of time, but we'll start there. Yeah. But who's the fly in the ointment again? The Jews came, they walked that 50 miles just to give them a bad time. You know, I'd hate to be one of those people on the judgment day, because they're not going to have an answer for their attitude and their actions. They're just going to stay there. They're going to stand and go, because there's no reason for their actions. Anyway, we'll take that up next week. Thanks for your attention and your questions, and may God bless each and every one of you.